Welcome back to BHookedCrochet.com. I'm your host Brittany. This is video number 3 of the crocheted teddy bear. If you're just joining us, you're going to want to check out the link in the description below for more information on this pattern. Video number 3 is going to cover the assembly and the detailing of our bears, and by the end of this video, we'll have finished up our project. Now that we've finished crocheting all the components to our bears, now we're going to talk about stuffing and assembly, and then later on we're going to cover the details to the face. So for right now, what I've done off camera is I took some craft beads to put at the bottom of the body and each one of the forelegs. Now this is an optional task. Now you don't actually have to do this, but I would at least recommend it for the body. Now the first bear that I made, I did not add the extra weight to the bottom, and it actually has some trouble sitting straight up. So basically the weight is just going to help it sit properly and the arms to stay down. If you don't have any craft beads available, you can also use just uncooked dry rice. That actually works perfectly unless you plan on washing this. If you're going to put it in the washer, definitely don't use rice. So for the stuffing portion, you're just going to need some type of polyfill. You can pick it up at any craft store. And this part is pretty self-explanatory. Now you just want to stuff everything quite full, and you'll do a little bit of shaping throughout this process. And it doesn't matter which component you start with. Now one thing you do want to make sure is that the tails that you left when you bind it off, you want to make sure those are out, that they didn't get stuffed into the body or, you know, the arms or the legs. So we're going to use those to sew the bear together. So as you can see, I'm putting quite a bit of stuffing in there. I want the body to be pretty full, so I'm just going to stuff it as much as I can fit in there. Now another thing you want to be certain of, depending on how you crochet, I'm pretty notorious for crocheting tightly, so you can't actually see the polyfill through the stitches, like through these little areas. But if you tend to crochet looser, you may experience a little bit of problem with this, and if that's the case, you may just want to stuff it a little bit on the lighter side. Now once you've pretty much got everything stuffed, you want to continue stuffing all the way to the opening. So it's okay if you've got a little bit of stuffing sticking out, especially for the body portion. What I'm doing right here, we're going to sew the head on right here. We don't want this part to be empty because then it'll flop around and the head won't sit up straight. So go ahead and finish stuffing each one of your components, and next we'll talk about sewing everything together. Okay, so once you have everything stuffed, we're going to go ahead and start on the assembly. Now I like to start on the arm, so go ahead and grab your body, and you'll need your darning needle, and then we'll just thread the long tail from the arm. Now one thing about the stuffing of the arm, I do leave it a little bit bare up towards the top, and that's just so the arms will lay better. So if you have too much stuffing, you might want to take a little bit out before you sew it on. Then you're going to want to pick the front of the bear. Now I typically try to make the front somewhere away from a decrease. So you can see this is the decreasing rows right here. So I'll turn it to the side a little bit so that way the front looks a little bit cleaner. Now basically all we're going to do is just lay the arm just right next to the top of the body, and we're going to be working in whip stitches. So we have our bind off areas roughly in the center, so I'm just going to work the darning needle under a stitch of the body, so I've caught both of the loops there, and then I'm going to work it under this first row of stitches right here and then straight across to the other side, and then just pull that, and now just work your way to the side. So then just grab the next stitch, and you basically want all of the stitches to be in a line, and just keep working until you've reached the end, and then we'll work our way back to the back part of the arm. Okay, so I've reached the edge there. Now I'm just going to rework myself back to the other side so we can stitch up the back portion of the arm. And there's really no clear-cut way of doing this that I have found. Really, you know, you just have the same goal in mind. You just want to get it as secure as possible and as straight as possible. Now if you sew it on in a place that you're not really happy with, you can basically take out these stitches and rework them. It's a little bit of a pain, but you know, if you've got a limb or something on crooked, it's definitely worth it. So now that I've got the arm completely secure, and like I said, you want to make sure that you catch the stitches in the back. Now you can see I've got a stitch loose right there, so I'm just going to go ahead and make another stitch there. Make sure that I catch that back portion. There we go, so that it's secure. We don't want the arms to fall off. And go one more, and as you work this around your last stitch, you want to go ahead and just make a knot. So I've just made a stitch and then I'm just pulling the end through it. And once you've completed that, I like to weave this tail in underneath the arm because it's a place that you're not really going to see. And just like if you're weaving in your ends with a finished crocheted piece, it's the same concept here. You're just going to work it underneath some of the stitches. And now I don't have much of a tail left, so I'll probably just go through one pass of stitches and then just trim off that extra little piece. Now we've got one arm in place. We'll go ahead and do just the exact same thing for the other one. So again, you want to make sure that it's straight. So I'm going to try to make this almost exactly on the opposite side of where I just stitched on that first arm. Now most of this seam is going to be covered up by the head, so if it doesn't look beautiful, it's not that big of a deal. Okay, now again, once you've got that secure, just go ahead and start your loop, and then I usually just catch it with my finger there. And then just put the needle back through that loop. That's going to tie off a little knot. And then now it's safe then to weave in this tail. Now we'll move on to the next portion. Okay, the next thing we're going to be working on are the legs. So we'll just go ahead and thread the tail from one of the legs. And since we're going to be using a button to hold these on and basically thread the needle through the other side, we'll need to go ahead and just whip stitch this closed. So just whip stitch the top of the leg closed. Okay, and then do the same thing for the other leg. Now that we've got the legs sewn together up at the top, we're going to go ahead and add a button to each leg before we actually stitch that into place. So I'm using black buttons, so I just have some spare black yarn, and I'm just going to sew it to the top. Now again, I want to try to make sure I get this roughly in the center. Okay, and then now we're just going to simply do that to the other side. Now to attach the legs to the body, we need to take a large darning needle. This is the largest one that I have, so it has to be able to go all the way through the body. So you want to make sure you have a long one so it doesn't get lost in there. And I just have a scrap piece of yarn that's about 3 feet or so, I'd say. And I'm going to double this, that way I have a little bit of extra security. So once we get that set up, then we'll take the body, and it's best to use the arm as a guide to be able to tell you where to put it. Now, the way that we're going to be attaching these, they should swivel a little bit up and down, so you can make it move from the sitting position to a standing position. And you just want to make sure wherever you place these, that if it's in the sitting position, that it's not below the bottom. Otherwise, it's not going to sit up straight. So once you have it in a good position, then you'll just need to take your darning needle with that spare piece of yarn, and you're going to want to go underneath the button, or go as close to it as you possibly can, and just feed that directly in and then out the other side. Now you may have to squeeze it a little bit with your hand, but you can see it's coming out the other side, and then you'll just pull that through. Okay, so you want to make sure that you leave a little bit of slack on this other side so we can tie it off. And then just double check your placement, because once you get this attached again, you can remove it, but it's a little bit difficult. Just more time consuming, really. Okay, so set that down, and now since we've got the yarn feeding out the other side, we're just going to grab the leg and working from the back, so a portion away from the band, and you just want to put it directly through. And like I said, I'm getting as close to the button as I can. We want to make it seem like the buttons are what are holding it on, but when actually they aren't. So there, we'll pull that through and just let that sit for a second, and then you want to go ahead and tie off the other side. Now I'm just going to make a double knot, and we're really just tying this off so that way it doesn't move, because we're going to go back through and we want to give it a little bit of a tug to make sure that they're nice and secure. So I want to make sure when I'm going back through that I'm not going into the same stitch, otherwise I'll just work it back out rather than securing it. And again, I just need to make it so that it comes out the other side. In a different spot, but still right next to that button. There we go. Okay. Now it's safe to go ahead and pull that a little bit tight. Now you don't want to make it so tight that it just totally scrunches the body together. I mean, you want the legs to be able to move like you see here, but it needs to be tight enough that they stay up next to the body. And once you get that going, then you can just trim off that darning needle and then just tie this in a knot. Okay, so with those attached, now we can go ahead and focus on weaving in some of these loose tails, kind of get them out of the way. Okay, I'm just going to demonstrate for you one side here, and then you can go ahead and weave in the remaining tails. So we're not going to do anything with this tail. This is the tail coming from the body. We're going to leave that there, but you'll want to weave in all of the tails just from the legs, so where we've secured it and where we sewed it together. Now when you're weaving these in, you don't want to weave it into the body, because if you do, then the leg won't be able to move. So you want to weave it into the actual leg stitches. And now this one has already been tied off, so we don't have to worry about it coming apart. So just weave it in a couple times and trim it off. Now go ahead and weave in the remaining tails from this leg. Once you have the ends woven in for both of your legs, we're actually going to go ahead and set the body aside for now, and you want to grab the head and the nose, and we're going to stitch this into place. Now I'm going to flip this over so you can see all of the tails. So this is from where I stitched on the nose, and all of the tails from the gray yarn as well, so basically where I crocheted it and bind it off. I leave those tails into the nose, and that way it will kind of fill the gap. Now you can use a little bit of stuffing if you'd like, if you don't have enough yarn in there. And actually we're going to pull out the gray one where we bind it off. We're going to use that to stitch it in place. So I've got all of the remaining tails in there, and something that I like to use, it's completely optional, I actually like to take some pins and pin it into place, because that way I can get it into place and see it and make sure it's not crooked before I actually go through the trouble of sewing it on. So you'll just kind of eyeball this. You can use the pictures that are available at the link in the description below to give you an idea of where to stitch on the nose, but I typically just line up the top portion. I don't set it directly on the eye, like the felt where the eye is, but I go just a tiny bit below that. And then, like I said, I just take some pins to pin it into place. So honestly, the head portion and doing the detailing and everything is probably the more time-consuming part of this pattern, and definitely the most time-consuming part for the sewing together, because you want to make sure that everything is straight, otherwise it looks really funny. Okay, and I don't usually put a lot of pins, just a few to kind of hold it in place. And then once you get it situated and in a place that you like, then the rest is just very self-explanatory. We're going to use a whip stitch again. So you just want to thread that tail from the nose onto your darning needle. So I'm actually repositioning it a little bit. You'll notice, even with having it pinned, it kind of shifts on you. So I would recommend just stitching, making a couple of stitches and then taking a step back and looking at it and repositioning it. Once you get about half of it stitched, it's not going to move anymore, but the first couple of stitches are definitely the hardest. I definitely always say this is the most critical part to any type of amigurumi pattern, because it doesn't matter how good you crochet the different components, if they're sewn on crooked or uneven, it can just ruin the whole look. Okay, once you get it sewn into place, then we can just weave in this remainder tail that we have here, and again you just run it back and forth underneath some of the stitches. Now I'm trying to hide this within my seam to make it look a little bit more professional. And once you get that woven in nice and secure, we'll just trim that off. At this point we're ready to sew on the head, and I would say this is one of the more difficult parts as well. It's really easy for the head to shift on you as you're stitching it, and actually the first bear that I did, the head is turned just a little bit slightly to the side, so you want to be careful of that. Use your pins to pin it in place if you feel like that'll help you. And what I have done off camera is just thread the darning needle for the head. So this is the tail that's coming from the head. And I want to make sure, and like I said, I'm just looking at it at the front, making sure that everything is straight. Because if you're like me, if you sew it on crooked, it's going to really bother you. So I'm actually starting at the point that's right next to the arm, and again we're just whip stitching this just the same as we have been doing, and again I'm gonna make a couple of stitches and then I'm going to stop and look. And so what I'm doing here is I'm catching the entire stitch on the body, and then I'm grabbing the entire stitch on the head. And that's pretty important. We don't want this to come apart, so we want to make sure that we have it nice and secure. And again, I'm double checking to make sure everything looks straight. You can try to hold it in place, but since we are actually moving the head from the body in order to get to the stitches, it makes us a little bit more susceptible to moving it. Okay, once you've got it fully stitched into place, then we can go ahead and weave in that tail. So I'm actually going to weave it in through the back here. My stitches look a little bit loose, these first couple, so I'm just going to go over this real quick to tighten up this seam. Okay, and now again I'm just going to hide the tail in the seam. And now we can just trim that off. Now we left the other tail here from the body, and that was just in case we needed it to stitch on the head. So if you didn't leave a long enough tail, then you could have picked up with this one, but my tail from the head was long enough that I could sew the entire thing on. So I'm just going to go ahead and weave this in as well. Okay, we can trim that off. So the next thing that we're going to be working on, since we've got the majority of the bear assembled, we're going to start working on the ears next. So you're going to want to grab your piece of felt and your 2 ears and a pair of scissors so that we can cut the felt into a little shape to fit into the ears. And you'll also need a hot glue gun if you're going to glue it in place. That's what I'm going to be doing. And if you would rather stitch them on, you can do that as well. I'll be the first to admit that my hand stitching is not the prettiest, so I've chosen to hot glue the felt pieces into place. The cool thing about this pattern is that you can dress it up for any occasion. The bear that I'm creating now is actually going to be a Valentine bear, so I'm going to make it have a more Valentine and hearts theme about it. So I've chosen to go with a dark pink for my felt, but like I said, you can use any color you choose to fit whatever occasion you're making this for. So the first thing that we want to do is cut out little felt pieces that are going to go inside the ears. Now when we stitch these into place, we're going to kind of curve it a little bit, and so the felt is just going to rest in this little area right here. And I just freehand this. So I just take a little square and then just start cutting. Now I tend to make it a little on the big side first, and that way I can trim it down a little bit later. So this is definitely a trial and error process, but once you have one cut out the way you like, then you can use that as a template for the other ones so they look exactly the same. Now typically what I like to do is just get the size right first, and then I work on the finer details. So for me, that size is pretty good. You want to make sure that you don't cover up the edge of stitches right here, because that's what we're going to use to sew it into place. Once you have the centers of your ear cut out, then you can go ahead and, like I said, either stitch them in place if you're going to like embroider them on, or you can use the hot glue gun. So go ahead and glue those centers into place. Now we're ready to sew the ears onto our bear. And this part takes a little bit of patience. What I like to do is count the rounds from the head. So we want to make sure that we've got these in the same place. So I like to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I attach the top part to the 6th round. And as I mentioned before, we're going to kind of curve these a little bit, curve the ears, and I count 4 stitches from the eye. So 1, 2, 3, and 4, and that's about where I want to place it. So you can eyeball yours and make sure that that looks like a good place. So that's just what I have done for the other bear. That's what I'll do for this one. And we're going to do the same method of stitching. We're just going to whip stitch the ear into place. And as I said, if you need to use some, either an extra darning needle to hold the ear in place or some pins, that will definitely make your life much easier. The last thing that we have to sew into place is the tail, and so you just want to line it up roughly where you want it, and we're just going to sew this on in the same way. We're just going to whip stitch. Now with the tail sewn into place, we're just about finished with our bear. And the next thing that we want to work on is the detailing for the feet. So what I've done off camera, again, since I'm doing a Valentine theme bear, I cut 2 little hearts. And what I'm going to do is hot glue them to the bottoms of the feet. So this is an optional step. If you'd like to use an oval or a circle or a different shape, you can do so, but go ahead and finish up the detailing on your feet. The last thing that we have to do is to do the detailing on the face. So we're going to take this face right here and make it much more detailed, like you see in this face here. And I'll be honest, I think the detailed look is really what makes this pattern. So what you're going to need is a few strands of your yarn that coordinates with your bear. We're going to use 2 strands that are about 1.5 feet long, and we're going to use that to make the eyes sink in just a little bit, make it a little more realistic. And then we're also going to use another 2 strands that are around the same length to do the eyelids. And we're actually going to crochet those. The first thing that we're going to do is the eye shaping. So we're going to just take some yarn to make the eyes sink in a little bit. So you'll want to thread one of your scrap pieces of yarn, and you're going to want to insert that through the back of the head and through the front, and get it as close to the eyeball as you can, and then leave yourself a little bit of slack on the other side. And now what you want to do is go back down, skip down just a little bit so that you're not feeding it through the exact same place, and then feed this needle back through to the other side. Okay, so there we can't see the stitch in the front, and then as we pull on the strands in the back, do you see how that kind of gathers in the eye and kind of gives it a little bit more of a realistic shape. Now what you want to do from the back side is we will tie a knot, and you want to watch how tight you pull that, because the tighter you pull it, the more it's going to sink in on the front. And I go ahead and do a double knot just so it doesn't come out, and then we can just weave these little tails into the stitches to hide them. And now we just want to repeat those same steps for the other eye. Now the next thing that we're going to add are the eyelids. So we just want to take another one of those scrap pieces and make a slip knot. And now all we need to do is chain 4. And then go ahead and pull the tail through the loop that was on your hook. And we just want to do that twice. So that's the first one. Okay, and now we're ready to stitch those into place. Okay, what I like to do is make it so that the braided portion is facing out. I think it looks a little bit neater. And then we'll just thread and you just want to lay it in place. And again, this might be a situation where pinning it first is a little helpful for you, but just kind of eyeball it. Again, you can use the pictures for reference. And then I'm just going to just slide my needle underneath one of the stitches and then just pull that out. And then I'm just going to release that from the darning needle and thread the other side. Now again, we're going to do this the same way. Once you get it into the proper position, then we'll just grab one of the stitches and pull it right on through. Now the idea is to have the eyelid lay flat on the body, and sometimes when you sew them on they will lay flat. In this particular instance it's not wanting to lay flat, so what I'm going to do is just work this strand up to the middle portion of the eyelid, and then once I get there I'm just going to just catch one of the loops of the chain and pull on that. Now I don't want to pull too tight to make it look distorted, but I just want it tight enough so that it allows the eyelid to lay flat. And once you get that finished, then we can just weave in these tails, and then you'll just repeat these same steps for the other side. Once you've finished your eyelids, we have one final detail, and that is the hair. at the top. Now again, this is an optional step, but what you want to do if you're going to do this is cut yourself 3 strands that are about 6 to 8 inches long. We're going to make it extra long and we'll trim it up later on. Now what you want to do, you'll want to take a larger darning needle so that you can thread all 3 of these at the same time. And now looking at the top of the bear, you're going to go directly into the center and then come right back out, just right next to it. And pull that through about halfway, and then you can remove the needle. And then we're just going to tie each of these, just tie 2 of them together. If you tie them all at once, the knot is a little bit too big and it kind of looks big and bulky. So we're just going to do 2 at a time. Okay, once you have those tied into place, then we can go ahead and trim off. Let's leave it about 1.5 inches or so. You want to give yourself a little bit of wiggle room. And what we're going to do is unply the yarn. So this particular yarn looks like it has 4 strands, so I'm going to just untwist them. And you want to do that for each one of the strands. Okay, once you've got most of them pulled apart, we can trim off a little bit more. So this time we'll make it about 1 inch long. And part of the reasons why we're doing it little by little is because the yarn, as you can kind of see it in the picture, the yarn is going to fall apart a little bit when you're unplying them. You're going to get some of the fibers that are just completely falling out. And once you get it completely pulled apart, then you can just trim up that one final time. And you want to leave it about a little bit more than 1/2 inch, I'd say, long. If you leave it any longer than that, it kind of looks silly. Okay, now with that in place, the last thing that you can do is, if you're wanting to have some rosy cheeks like we see on this bear, you can just take some blush out of your makeup stash, and just a cotton ball or even like a makeup brush works fine too, and just kind of brush it on each one of the cheeks. Something else that you can do that actually looks really cute as well is you can crochet or knit, if you're a knitter, a little scarf to go around the bear, or as I said, you can dress it up or dress it down depending on the theme that you're going for. With that, this concludes our tutorial on the crochet teddy bear. You can find all of the information, the supplies list, everything you need at BHookedCrochet.com at that link in the description below. Until next time, I'm your host Brittany. On behalf of BHookedCrochet.com, we'll see you next time.